On September 26, 1931, the U.S. began work on its first purpose-built aircraft carrier, the 14,576-ton Ranger, which was completed June 4, 1934. Not only was she the first purpose-built carrier, but the first built by Newport News. This, in its own right, was a milestone. Newport News would go on to build more large carriers than anyone else, including all of today's nuclear supercarriers. Like in other countries, there was debate on what form future carriers should take. Some thought large carriers like the Lexingtons were the way to go, even if their numbers would be limited. Remember, the treaties limited not just individual, but also total tonnage. Others thought more numerous smaller carriers were preferable, ones similar in size to Langley. It was an argument that made some sense. More numerous smaller carriers would be in more places, even if they were slower getting there due to less machinery. Also, while not as survivable due to less protection, the loss of any individual one wouldn't be as operationally detrimental as losing one of a few large carriers. They would also be individually cheaper. They would also be able to carry more aircraft, though not more per ton. Construction time could also be considerably shorter, and more yards would be capable of building them. Individual operating costs would also be lower. As a result, even before there was adequate time to compare the small Langley and the large Lexingtons, design work began on Ranger. By building smaller ships, it was hoped that 5 carriers could be built with the remaining tonnage rather than 3 at the maximum tonnage of 27,000 tons each. Many things were done to keep weight down while maximizing the number of aircraft that could be carried and maximizing their operations. Propulsion reverted to direct drive. Turboelectric was expensive and, most importantly, too heavy in a weight-restricted environment. Weight of machinery became even more important than fuel economy or speed. Direct drive was also getting more efficient anyways, with better horsepower to weight ratios due to higher pressure and temperature boilers. Originally planned to be built without an island to maximize deck space and airflow, hence the funnel placement, a small one was added during construction. Experience with the Lexingtons had proved its worth. Not only did it give navigation and flight deck controllers a better view, but it got exhaust out of the way and gave pilots a reference point when landing. Ranger introduced the practice of suspending aircraft from the hangar ceiling. Ranger introduced deck edge outriggers to maximize deck parking. Ranger was also the first to introduce deck edge galleries for her anti-aircraft guns so they could have the widest possible arcs while firing, while not infringing on the limited area of the flight deck. This was very important since it was considered that the main threat to carriers was from dive bombers, since they could close from too high an altitude for most of the anti-aircraft guns to reach and attack the carrier's thin deck armor and fueled planes. Indeed, the kamikaze was a type of dive bomber. Ranger also introduced forward arresting wires so that aircraft could land over the bow. This was again seen as a way of maximizing air group operations and numbers. If the rear of the deck was unusable due to either damage or because it had planes spotted to launch there, it was hoped planes could land over the bow. It was also hoped that this could save fuel, thus smaller fuel storage, since if the carrier could land aircraft over the bow, it wouldn't need to leave formation as radically to get the right wind over the deck and then have to race to rejoin the fleet. It also might mean that a carrier scouting for the battle fleet, which was their intended role for the time, might be able to avoid having to turn toward the enemy's fleet to recover its aircraft. Another change was the placement, size, and number of the elevators. Experience with Langley showed that having the elevator or elevators sited only midship was operationally difficult, especially in view of the full strike, launch everything you have tactics that tended to achieve the best results by overwhelming an enemy. While both launching and landing, midship elevators became not only useless but potentially a liability due to the hole in the deck and the cutting of the hangar in half. When landing, aircraft had to be parked at the bow until all incoming planes were on board. Only then could they begin moving them to the hangar. When launching, all the planes had to be brought up and moved to the stern. Only once the deck was full, or all the aircraft were up, could launching commence. An elevator at the edge of the deck was a better solution. By putting an elevator at the rear of the flight deck and hangar, aircraft could continuously be brought up without interrupting takeoff operations. Unfortunately, the other two remained midship. This concept would be expanded upon with the addition of a bow elevator that lowered to the front of the hangar in the next class, and would eventually reach its peak post-war with the all-deck edge elevator arrangement. A good, if not obvious, change was the placement of the aircraft workshops. On Lexington, these were placed at the rear of the hangar. Unfortunately, as with most ships, at high speed, this area had a tendency to vibrate, making fine machining of things like gears a difficult task. So, when Ranger was built, these shops were moved from behind the hangar to in front, where they would remain on all future large carriers. Probably the most significant change from a design point of view, though, was the layout of the hangar and flight deck. This was mostly done to save the all-important weight. Whereas the previous Lexingtons treated the hangar as part of the hull, the flight deck being the strength deck, Ranger moved the strength deck down to the hangar floor. In effect, the hangar and flight deck were relatively light superstructure built on top of the main hull, sort of a modular design. This had 4 critical benefits. First, it lowered the center of gravity, making the ship relatively more stable for her weight, width, and length. Second, because the hangar and flight deck supports didn't have to be as strong or thick or numerous to support the greater weight associated with being part of the main hull, there was more room in the hangar for a relatively larger air group. Third, for the same reason, it also meant there could be openings in the hangar to allow aircraft engines to be warmed up or tested there. The fourth major benefit was repairs and reconstruction. Because the hangar wasn't part of the ship's hull, but rather a light structure built on top of it, in the event of major damage, it could be repaired relatively quickly and easily. As long as the damage was kept above the hangar floor, the ship's frame was relatively safe. In terms of modifications, especially post-war reconstruction, this also meant ships could be heavily reconstructed relatively quickly and cheaply. Ultimately, though, operational experience with Langley and the Lexingtons settled the size question. Larger was preferable. In a way, by limiting total tonnage for reasons given at the start of this review, operational experience showed that the treaties favored larger carriers. So, the Navy, who had long ago decided to build only the best it could since anything else was a waste of resources, abandoned the small carrier and went larger until treaty restrictions and wartime expediency demanded it. As completed and throughout her career, Ranger was a good ship. On paper. While able to carry almost as many aircraft as the much larger Lexingtons and later Yorktowns, this was only possible by carrying a higher percentage of fighters, which were smaller than attack aircraft such as dive bombers. The situation was aggravated by her magazines. They were smaller than those on large carriers and thus couldn't carry as many bombs. In fact, as completed, to save weight and for reasons already discussed, she had no torpedo stowage. Admittedly, this problem was mitigated by the small air group and an even smaller number of attack planes. Below the hangar in the main hull, it got worse. Doing so much on so little out the door meant she had virtually no growth margins, both in terms of hull volume, strength, or stability. Any modernization that added weight worth speaking of would have required major structural work and the fitting of bulges that would have reduced her speed even more. Speaking of speed, it had also been sacrificed. It was okay for operating with the 21-knot battleships, but was barely adequate for a fleet carrier. Also, being relatively light, long, and tall meant that despite her low center of gravity, she was a relatively lively ship, making landings in heavy seas difficult. Protection was also negligible. Worst of all, though, was structural strength. In the official opinion of one of her captains, she was so weakly built that if she was hit by even a single torpedo, she would most likely break in half. This was no flippant remark by one overly cautious captain, and the belief was quietly shared by many. As a result, during World War II, she was the only large carrier not sent to the front lines of the Pacific. Even during the carrier crisis of late 1942, early 43, the Sangamon-class carriers were sent instead. In fact, she wasn't even sent into the Mediterranean. She just wasn't risked anywhere there was a chance of concerted air attack. Generally, she should be thought of as an escort carrier. Main armament was 8 single open-mounted 5-inch 25 caliber guns. Originally, these were placed with 2 at the bow, 2 at the stern, and 1 near each corner of the flight deck. Propulsion was provided by 6 boilers venting to 6 funnels, 3 on each side. These cranked out the sides of the ship and came up in the sides of the flight deck. When launching and recovering aircraft, they could be lowered to the horizontal to keep the flight deck clear of smoke. The steam went to 2 turbines. These produced 53,500 horsepower and directly drove the 2 propellers for a maximum speed of 29 knots. Again, there was 1 rudder. Armor was light. 2 inches protected the sides of the steering gear with 2-inch bulkheads. Deck armor was a mere 1 inch over the steering gear. The engine room was fairly well divided. Each turbine was in a separate room, fitted end to end. Behind them was the 3 boiler rooms, each with 2 boilers. There was no TDS to speak of, only a double hull where the ship's and aviation fuel could be stored. The flight deck was 709 by 86 feet. There was no catapult. There were 3 elevators, the 2 midships and 1 right at the end of the flight deck. The 2 midship ones were 51 3/4 feet by 41 feet. The rear one was 39 3/4 by 34 3/4 feet. The hangar was 510 feet long, 56 feet wide, and 19 feet high, taking up 2 levels. It spanned the rear 80% of the length of the structure, with the forward 20% being devoted to 2 floors of repair shops. Unlike the Lexingtons, it was an open hangar. This meant there were numerous holes in the sides, allowing the aircraft engines to be run in the hangar for both testing and warming up. The bow and stern were also open to allow the fitting of light and medium anti-aircraft guns. 86 aircraft could initially be carried, but by the start of the war, this would be down to the low 70s. About 54 fighters and 18 dive bombers were carried during the first year of the war. As the war went on, it would drop even more. By the end of the war, she had been relegated to training and had no permanent air group. Modifications were light due to her limited growth margins. Soon after completion, the end-on 5-inch guns were moved next to the deck-edge ones, giving her a pair near each corner of the flight deck. Stowage for torpedoes was added. In mid-1944, in preparation for transferring to the Pacific, she landed her 5-inch guns and replaced them with medium anti-aircraft guns. Also, a flight deck catapult was added for training. As with most ships, her radar and other electronics were updated throughout the war. Ranger was in the Atlantic on December 7, 1941. She spent most of 1942 training pilots and ferrying aircraft to West Africa. At the start of November of 1942, she took part in the invasion of Casablanca on Morocco's Atlantic coast. A month later, she returned to the East Coast and continued training and ferrying aircraft to Africa. In early October of 1943, she joined the British Home Fleet to raid the German-occupied Norwegian port of Bodo. Returning to the East Coast a few months later, in early December of 1943, she then resumed training and ferrying aircraft to North Africa. In mid-July of 1944, she transferred to the Pacific and spent the rest of the war training pilots at the West Coast and Hawaii. She was finally decommissioned in mid-October of 1946 and sold for scrap.